Unbroken follows the story of Louis Zamperini. It is written by Laura Hillenbrand. Part 1 of the book focuses on Louis' childhood and running. Part 2 of the book focuses on Louis' war journey. And Part 3 of the book focuses on Louis' life in a POW camp. And Part 4 of the book focuses on his recovery from that POW camp. The story starts with Louis as a very young child. When he was 2 years old, he got pneumonia, so his mother made him rest in his crib, but he wanted out. He climbed out his crib, jumped out the window, and went on a naked tear down the street with a police officer chasing him. It would not be his last encounter with the police. When he was 5, he started smoking. He found discarded cigarette butts on the sidewalk while walking into kindergarten. When he was 8, he started drinking. He snuck his parents' wine bottle under the table, drank the whole thing, staggered outside, and then he fell into a rose bush. Louis was always stealing something. He always had a lock-picking wire in his pocket. He loved to steal things and make money illegally, and his older brother Pete was always with him, but Pete was smart enough to hide when the police showed up. Pete remembered most of Louis' stories ended with, "And then I ran like mad." In high school, Louis started running. When he was in his first race, he hated it because the girls on the track team dared him to run a 660-yard race barefoot. He came in last place. After training for a while, he ended up placing better, which gave him more attention. He loved attention, so he trained harder and harder. Eventually, he was the best mile runner in the school. He got a time of 5 minutes and 6 seconds. In the summer of 1932, Louis did almost nothing but running. 2 years later, in 1934, he got the national high school record, which was 4 minutes, 21 seconds, and 3 milliseconds. He beat the previous record by more than 2 seconds. Louis' record stood for 19 years. The next big thing he wanted to do was win the gold in the 1936 Olympics. The mile was not an event in the Olympics, so mile runners did the 1,500 meters. Louis couldn't make himself go fast enough for that, so Pete thought Louis should try the 5,000 meters. The 5,000 was over 3.5 miles. To make the Olympics, he would have to stay with Norman Bright, the second fastest 5,000-meter runner. During the qualifying race, Louis did just that. He only missed first place by an inch. He made the Olympics and he only had 2 weeks of training. During the actual Olympic race, Louis was doing fine until he smelled something terrible. One of the runners had hair product in that made Louis nauseous. Louis slowed down and there were only 3 stragglers behind him. After the nausea passed, he thought of Pete. Pete had given Louis encouragement before the last race started. Louis gave everything he had on the last lap. On the last lap of a 5,000-meter run, doing it under 70 seconds was impressive. Even on a mile run, running the last lap under 65 seconds was impressive. Louis ran his last lap in 56 seconds. Louis came in 8th place, which he was not thrilled about. He knew that the 1,500 would be his event at the next Olympics in 1940. He was training harder and harder until April 1940, when an announcement came out about the Olympics. They were canceled because of the World War that was going on. Louis was crushed. He felt like his life had no more purpose. So because he had no purpose, he joined the U.S. Air Corps. The captain of Louis' crew was Russell Allen Phillips, or as Louis nicknamed him, Phil. Phil and Louis became good friends. They went on many missions together, many going so badly that more than one crew member died. On one mission, they landed back at base with 594 bullet holes in their plane called the Superman. None of those missions would compare to the rescue mission they went on in 1943. Another crew went missing, so the leader of the Air Corps had Phil, Louis, and 9 other men look for him. Since the Superman had a lot of bullet holes in it, they had to take a different plane. The plane they took was the Green Hornet, a very unreliable plane. Phil, Louis, and 9 other men went up in the plane. While they were searching, both engines on one side of the plane stopped working. They went down hard. Louis only thought one thing while they were crashing. No one's going to live through this. When the ship crashed, Phil bumped his head on something in the cockpit. The glass shattered when the plane hit the water, so Phil had an uncomplicated way of getting out. He climbed out of it, pushed off with his foot. He made it to the surface and clung to a floating fuel tank while his head gushed blood. He had survived. The ship's tail gunner, Francis McNamara, somehow climbed out of the sinking plane and swam to the surface. McNamara, or Mac, swam over to Phil and clung to the fuel tank with him. He had survived. When the ship crashed, Louis got tangled in wire. After a few minutes of struggling, he passed out. He woke up after about 30 seconds. He struggled as hard as he could and broke out. He pushed off the plane and swam to the surface. He had survived. The rafts on the plane that were for a crash were floating away from Louis. It would be the three men's only chance of survival. Louis saw a string attached to the raft and he grabbed it. He rowed over to Phil and Mac. There were two rafts and Louis tied them together. He took Phil's shirt and wrapped it tightly around Phil's head to stop the bleeding. And he gave one raft to Phil. And Mac and him shared the other one. No one else had surfaced. The raft had pouches with supplies for people who crashed, but there wasn't much. There was bitter chocolate bars designed so people would only eat them when necessary, a flare gun, pliers, a mirror, a few half-pint tins of water, a patching kit, air pumps, and some fishing supplies, with no bait. There was nothing for shade, so being sunburnt, bleached, and scorched was inevitable. After Phil stopped bleeding and woke up, Louis came up with some rules. He only allowed them to have 2 sips of water a day and 2 small pieces of chocolate a day. The next afternoon, Phil and Louis fell asleep. When they were asleep, Mac had a feast. He ate all the chocolate they had. When Louis and Phil woke up, they were upset. Louis decided that it wasn't a big deal because he believed they would be rescued in less than a day. Louis was half right. A plane flew over them a few hours later but didn't notice them even as they shot a flare. A few days later, another plane came by and they shot another flare. The plane was circling and they had spotted the raft. The men felt really happy until they saw what was on the wing, a Japanese insignia. The plane started firing at them. The men jumped into the water. The firing stopped, so they climbed back onto the rafts. Then it started again. Phil and Mac were too weak to get back into the water. When Louis went back into the water, the other men curled up on the rafts. When Louis came back up, both men were fine. This happened 2 more times. Somehow Mac and Phil survived. The plane flew away thinking they were dead. Phil's raft did not survive, though. The 3 men had to squeeze to fit in one raft. They were stranded for another month, and Mac grew thinner and thinner. Eventually, he died. Louis would not have survived the 33rd day without him, as a shark jumped on the raft and attacked Louis. Mac took a paddle and started whacking the shark. That took all of his strength. On the 46th day, they spotted something in the distance. It was land. They rowed over, thinking it was an uninhabited island. But it was not. It was Japanese territory, and they were captured. Louis and Phil were taken on boat to... I'm gonna mess this up. Which was one of the Marshall Islands controlled by the Japanese. On the boat, there was a doctor that treated them well. He fed them good food and tried to get them healthy. On one day, he weighed them. Phil weighed about 150 pounds before the plane crashed. Now he weighed 80 pounds. Louis weighed 160 pounds before the plane crashed. Now he weighed 67 pounds. Kwajalein was nicknamed Execution Island because almost no captives got out of there alive. Somehow both Louis and Phil got out there alive, and they were there for 42 days before taken to Japan. They thought they would be taken to prisoner of war camps, but they were taken to a secret interrogation center called Ofuna. After a few months, Phil was transferred to a real POW camp. They told him it was a very nice one, but it was actually the most despised one by POWs. Meanwhile, Louis was still at Ofuna. I think I'm saying that wrong. Slowly starving to death because of how little food they gave him. He longed for the raft. After a full year of being at Ofuna, Louis was transferred to Omori, which was a man-made sand split. While getting introduced to the guards, Louis met Matsuhiro Watanabe. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Watanabe was a psychopath, as Louis would soon find out. He would beat prisoners almost to death, and then the next day he would tell them how sorry he was, and he would give them candy and food. The next day he would beat the same prisoner. Watanabe, or the Bird, as prisoners called him, he was obsessed with Louis. He would beat Louis as often as he could. Louis never broke. He always stood tall while being beaten. He would also never look in the Bird's eye, which caused more beatings. Omori was terrible for Louis. Then one day Louis was told he could write a message to his family and speak it on the radio. So that was what he did. His family now knew he was alive. Louis was told he would get to record a new message, so he wrote another one down. They told him that he had to read their message, not his. Their message praised Japan and had beliefs that were the opposite of Louis'. He refused to read it. They told him he would be sent to punishment camp soon to pay for it. He was fine with that because any camp without the Bird would be like heaven for him. He realized why they had kept him alive for so long. The Japanese needed a famous American to be a spokesman on their side. They also kept Phil alive, probably so Louis would cooperate. When the Bird learned how Louis refused, he was mad. That caused more beatings on Louis, and the Bird would even foam at the mouth while doing it. A few weeks after this, the Bird was taken to a different camp. His reign of terror at Omori was over. A month later, Louis was sent to punishment camp. Once he got there, he had to meet the guards. One of the guards was the Bird. The Bird wasted no time. He started beating Louis right away. Life there was even worse than at Omori. They had to do work all the time, and they were basically slaves. After a few months of beatings, Louis was cleaning some steps when a guard pushed him off the steps for his amusement. Louis landed on one foot before the other, and he heard a tearing sound. He couldn't put any weight on that foot for about a month. Soon after, the Bird got randomly super angry at Louis. He made him hold a 6-foot-long wooden beam over his head. After 10 minutes, Louis started to fall. He cannot break me, Louis thought. He straightened up. He stayed there for 37 minutes before the Bird became so enraged that he ran into him, knocking him down. Livy had stayed there for about 6 months when the bird abruptly left. He just walked into the forest and didn't come back. The war was over. The bird had left so then he wouldn't be captured. All of the POWs were sent on a plane back to the U.S. Immediately after getting back, Louis was taken to a hospital. The doctors sat him down to talk about running. They told him he would never run again. Louis was crushed. Soon after the war, Louis had terrible PTSD. He had nightmares about the bird beating him up. In one of them, he was so upset that he strangled the bird. When he woke up, he was choking his newly married wife, Cynthia Applewhite, who had just become pregnant. Louis also had a drinking problem. When he would think of the bird, he would drink until the thought went away. Louis also tried running again. He was getting closer and closer to his old times until something awful happened. Louis' foot injury from Omori tore again. He never ran that fast again. After years of problems, Cynthia convinced Louis to go to one of Billy Graham's sermons. Afterward, Louis was a changed man. He never had another nightmare. He even went to Japan to forgive his captors. After countless more interviews and honor medals won, sadly Louis died in 2014. Somehow he outlived all his siblings, even though he had endured more than any of them, as they all died in 2008. So that's the story of Unbroken. I think it's a great story because it tells about history, and it's actually interesting to read, and it's like the perfect reading level for teenagers. Unless a teenager doesn't like to read, then this won't change their mind, because it's kind of hard to read, but it's a good book. So yeah, that is my review of Unbroken.